Every home has a history. The one behind me here at 111 Mt Paran Road really has a history. The land that this house sits on, as well as the land around us here along Mt Paran Road in Atlanta, was settled in the 1840s by the Burdett family, and across the street, the Jones family. They had large families, and over the years, they intermarried and farmed this land very successfully until finally, about 55 years after the Civil War, this house was built in 1920 and proceeded to have members of the Jones family live in this for several generations. It's fascinating when you do some sleuthing and you take the title searches back to the beginnings of these 100-year-old homes. Eva Mae Garman was the very first owner that is shown in the title from 1922. We've discovered that in 1926, 4 years later, she sold this house for the large sum of $75 to her cousin, who was Seaborn Jones Jr. Again, the Joneses and Burdetts lived right here on Mt Paran Road. The interesting thing is, as we continued with the title search, we noticed that this home remained in the Jones family until the 1950s. I'm standing in front of this historic marker that literally is across the street from 111 Mt Paran Road, and it explains how General Haskell led his Union soldiers here, and they took over the Burdett and Jones farms in preparation for the attack on Atlanta. This was one of 2 or 3 other locations that the Union soldiers prepared for that battle. And during this time period, the wives and their children were left behind as the men went off to war. We have some interesting documentation. Nellie Jett, who was a neighbor of the Burdetts and Joneses, had written a letter to her husband while at war, basically explaining the conditions they were living in. And she says here, "It is hard times here. For something to eat, we have to go to Gwinnett for corn. Meat is so high I can't buy it. I haven't the money. The children are always so hungry, and I'm afraid we won't get bread. I have never known hard times before. I'm going to sell the mule. I can't feed him. I would trade him for corn. I want you to come home if you can." So interesting way of living back then for the people that were in this area, and kind of gives you a sense for what they were going through. This beautiful park that is behind me here is the location of where Mt Paran Baptist Church used to be. We are just a few hundred yards away from 111 Mt Paran, and the members of both the Jones and the Burdett families were members of this church. In fact, the Thomas Burdett's oldest son was the very first minister here at Mt Paran Baptist. We would imagine that probably back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the family would walk here to services on Sundays. And the cemetery is adjacent, still here of course, that has most of the family members from the Burdetts and the Joneses. So we end our tour today in history on 111 Mt Paran Road, kind of where we started, with the Jones family and the Burdett family. And over the generations, obviously they became family members, neighbors and friends. And here in the Mt Paran Baptist Church Cemetery, we find Seaborn Jones here, who actually witnessed Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and his cousin, Benjamin Burdett, which is the headstone that you see here, buried literally 10 or 15 feet apart. They were cousins and obviously good friends and neighbors. Benjamin lost an arm at the Battle of Manassas, and here we find there are siblings and cousins and other family members buried here. And if you live in Atlanta, you'll recognize many of the headstones here. There would be families like the Powers and the Dalrymples, the Abernathys, the Langfords. Yeah, the list goes on and on. So it's a beautiful place to come visit on Mt Paran Road. I'd be curious to know about the history of your home, and I hope you've enjoyed this tour.